The first thing I remember wasn't pain. It was noise. A sharp, relentless beeping cut through the darkness, followed by a pressure in my chest so intense it felt as if someone had split me open from the inside. My body jerked violently, then went still. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat burned. My mouth was dry, like it had forgotten how to swallow. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. Then the ceiling came into focus, flat, white, and lit by unforgiving fluorescent lights. A hospital ceiling. A man leaned over me, his face swimming in and out of focus. His badge read Marcus, and his eyes carried a kind of practiced calm that told me the truth before he spoke. "You're okay, Mrs. Davis," he said gently. "You're stable now. Just rest." Okay. The word echoed in my head, hollow and unconvincing. My chest ached with every shallow breath. My thoughts felt scattered, like pages torn from a book and thrown into the air. I tried to grab onto something, anything familiar. Names surfaced slowly. Melissa. Jason. My children. I worked my tongue against cracked lips and forced the words out. Where are they? Marcus hesitated, just for a second, but I saw it. "Don't worry about that right now," he said gently. "Focus on resting." That night, the ICU quieted. Machines hummed softly. Footsteps faded. I drifted in and out of consciousness, suspended in a fog of medication and fear. Then I heard Marcus again. He was standing near my bed, speaking quietly into a phone. He didn't know I was awake. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "She's conscious now. Yes, she's stable. Would you like to speak to her?" I held my breath. A pause. Another pause. "All right," he said finally. "I understand." He lowered the phone and walked away. But his words stayed behind, sinking into me like poison. "Would you like to speak to her?" And whoever was on the other end, my daughter, had said no. My heart pounded harder than it had when the stroke hit. My own children knew I was alive. They had been told, and they had chosen silence. The next morning, a nurse came in to straighten the table beside my bed. As she lifted my water cup, something caught my eye. A folded piece of lined paper. My hand trembled as I reached for it. I unfolded it slowly, already bracing myself. "Gone for 10 days. Hope you're better when we get back. M and J." That was it. No phone number, no hospital questions, no promise to return early. Just a note you'd leave on a kitchen counter before heading to the beach. I didn't cry. Not then. Something heavier settled in my chest, a numbness deeper than pain. As the machines around me hummed and beeped, I realized the truth with terrifying clarity. While I lay in intensive care, fighting to breathe, the children I had raised had boarded a plane for vacation. 9 days later, I was discharged. They wheeled me out of the ICU with a paper bag of medications and a folder full of instructions. The only person there to sign me out was a hospital volunteer, a kind stranger who smiled politely and asked if I needed help into the transport van. Not Melissa, not Jason. The ride home to San Antonio was quiet. The driver adjusted the radio while I stared out the window, preparing myself for the comfort of familiar walls. But when the van stopped in front of my house, my stomach dropped. The curtains were different. The porch chairs were gone. I reached instinctively for the ceramic frog planter where I always kept a spare key. Empty. After knocking and fumbling for several minutes, the door finally opened. It wasn't my daughter. It wasn't my son. It was Ryan, my son-in-law, standing there with a Starbucks cup in his hand, eyes wide with panic. "Oh, Mrs. Davis," he stammered. "You're home. Sooner than we expected." I walked past him without speaking. The living room didn't feel like mine anymore. Furniture had been rearranged. The walls were half-painted a color I would never choose. My wedding photos, once proudly displayed, were shoved into a cardboard box in the corner. On the dining table lay a glossy flyer. I picked it up, hands shaking. Charming Southern home, ideal for young families. My house, my home of 27 years, for sale. My legs gave out, and I sank into a chair as the realization crashed over me. This wasn't neglect. This was preparation, and whatever I had survived in that hospital bed was only the beginning. As I sat there staring at the real estate flyer, one truth became painfully clear. My family hadn't just left me in the ICU, they had already started planning a future without me in it. I don't remember how long I sat there holding that flyer. Time stopped behaving normally the moment I realized my life had been rearranged without my consent. The words on the glossy paper blurred and sharpened again as my breathing grew shallow. Charming Southern home, ideal for young families. There was no mention of me, no acknowledgement that someone already lived there, or that I was still alive. Ryan hovered near the doorway, shifting his weight from one foot to the other like a child caught doing something wrong. "They thought you'd be gone longer," he said weakly, as if that explained anything. I looked up at him slowly. "Who is they?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His eyes flicked toward the hallway, toward the rooms that no longer felt like mine. "I should call Melissa," he muttered. "No," I said quietly. "You should leave." He hesitated, clearly unsure whether he had the authority to stay or go. That told me everything I needed to know. When the door finally closed behind him, the house fell silent. Not the comforting kind of quiet, but the kind that presses against your ears until you're forced to hear your own thoughts. I pushed myself up and walked through the rooms slowly. The couch was gone. The dining chairs replaced with mismatched folding ones. Drawers rearranged, closets thinned out. In the bedroom, half my clothes were missing. My jewelry box sat open, emptied except for a single broken earring I'd never liked. This wasn't panic. This was planning. On the kitchen counter sat a manila folder, its contents spread carelessly as if whoever had been sorting through it assumed I would never see it. I flipped it open and felt my stomach drop. Legal documents, power of attorney, my name, my signature. The date jumped out immediately, 3 years ago during my hip surgery. I remembered that day clearly. The anesthesia, the fog, Melissa sitting beside my bed, smiling gently, telling me it was just paperwork, something precautionary, something responsible. I had trusted her. Now that trust stared back at me in black ink. My hands shook as I reached for the iPad Jason used to leave on the pantry shelf. It still worked, miraculously. When the screen lit up, it opened to his messages automatically. I wasn't searching. The truth found me. Once the house sells, we'll finally have breathing room. Assisted living is lined up. No more boundaries. Boundaries. The word landed like a slap. I sank into a chair, my chest tightening, not from the stroke this time, but from the realization settling into place. This wasn't about convenience. This wasn't about help. They were removing me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table under a single dim bulb, staring at the flyer as if it were an obituary written in marketing language. My home reduced to a commodity, my existence inconvenient to their plans. By dawn, the numbness lifted, and something else replaced it. Resolve. I wasn't going to scream, I wasn't going to beg, and I certainly wasn't going to wait for them to finish erasing me. I remembered a name, Daniel Ruiz. Years ago, he had been my student, quiet, observant, always scribbling poetry in the margins of his notebooks. After graduation, he'd written me a letter thanking me for teaching him how words matter. Now he was a lawyer. I found his number and called as soon as his office opened. "Daniel?" I said when he answered, my voice steadier than I felt. "This is Eleanor Davis. Do you remember me?" He paused, then smiled through the phone. "Mrs. Davis? Of course. You taught me how to write. What's wrong?" I told him everything. The ICU, the note, the power of attorney, the real estate flyer, the messages I was never meant to see. He didn't interrupt. He didn't question my memory or suggest stress. When I finished, he said only one thing. They overreached. I met him that afternoon. His office was modest, a second-floor suite above a small restaurant, but the moment he reviewed the documents, his expression sharpened. This power of attorney doesn't authorize real estate transactions. They can't legally sell your home. Relief hit me so fast I had to grip the edge of his desk. "We can rescind this immediately and restore your full autonomy." For the first time since my heart stopped, I felt solid ground beneath my feet. Daniel filed the petition that same day. He moved fast, promised speed, promised discretion. When I returned home that evening, I walked through the house one final time, not as a victim, but as someone taking inventory. I gathered my emergency cash, my old notebook of passwords, the few things that truly mattered. Then I did something that surprised even me. I changed the locks. An hour later, Ryan showed up, rattling the door. Through the security camera, I said calmly, "Take your tools and leave, or I donate them." He didn't argue. As his car disappeared down the street, I understood something sharper than betrayal. I wasn't just their mother anymore. I was their obstacle, and they had underestimated me. By the time the court restored my rights, I already knew one thing for certain. Staying in that house meant waiting to be pushed out again, and this time I planned to leave on my own terms. The locks clicked into place with a finality that surprised me. I stood in the hallway holding the new keys, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. For the first time since leaving the ICU, the house felt still. Not safe yet, but still. And stillness gave me space to think. That night, I slept in my clothes. Not because I was afraid of intruders, but because I no longer trusted the idea of rest. My body had failed me once without warning. My family had taken advantage of that failure. I wasn't going to be unprepared again. In the early hours of the morning, I woke with a sharp clarity that cut through the lingering weakness in my limbs. If I stayed here, they would keep circling. They would wait for another moment of vulnerability, another surgery, another illness, another excuse to help. Help, I had learned, was a dangerous word. By sunrise, I had made a decision. I packed only what mattered: documents, medications, a few personal items, the photo albums they hadn't yet discarded. Everything else, furniture, decorations, years of accumulation, I left behind without sentiment. Attachment, I realized, was exactly what they were counting on. Daniel met me again that afternoon. He reviewed the emergency injunction that restored my full authority and handed me copies stamped and signed. "You're protected," he said, "but protection doesn't stop pressure." "I'm not staying," I told him. He nodded as if he had expected that. Then we should move quickly. We arranged temporary housing that same day, a small furnished apartment near the medical center, neutral, clean, anonymous, a place where no one knew my routines or felt entitled to my space. When I returned to the house one last time, Melissa's car was already parked in the driveway. She stood on the porch with her arms crossed, eyes sharp with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "What is going on?" she demanded the moment she saw me. "Why are the locks changed?" I didn't answer immediately. I walked past her, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. She followed, heels clicking angrily against the floor. "You can't just do this. We were trying to help you." I turned to face her then, really face her, not as her mother, not as someone seeking approval, but as an equal adult. "Helping doesn't involve selling someone's home without consent," I said calmly. Her jaw tightened. "You were sick. You still are. You don't know what's best for you right now." I smiled, just slightly. "That's not your decision to make." Daniel appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. He had always been better at hiding impatience behind politeness. "Mom," he said, "you're overreacting. We were planning long term. Assisted living is expensive. The house is mine," I interrupted. The word hung between us. "You signed the papers," Melissa snapped. "Yes, while sedated, which makes them voidable." Daniel explained that very clearly. Her eyes flicked toward the stack of legal documents in my hand. "You got a lawyer?" Jason asked, incredulous. I remembered who I was and what I taught you. Silence followed. Not guilt, not remorse, but calculation. "That apartment you're moving into," Melissa said slowly, "it's temporary, right?" I met her gaze. So is this conversation. I walked past them and up the stairs, retrieving the last of my belongings while they whispered urgently behind me. When I returned, suitcase in hand, neither stopped me. They had already moved on to damage control. The drive to the apartment was quiet. My body ached, but it was the good kind of ache, the kind that follows exertion instead of fear. That evening, I sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed and let myself breathe fully for the first time since the stroke. I was alive. I was lucid. I was not disposable. The next few days were a blur of appointments, new doctors, physical therapy, follow-ups Daniel insisted on scheduling to document my competency. Each checkmark felt like reclaiming territory. Then the call started. Melissa left messages full of concern and irritation, her tone shifting depending on what she thought would work. Jason sent texts about family meetings and reasonable compromises. I responded to none of them. Silence, when chosen deliberately, is power. In the 5th day, Daniel called. "They've listed the house, again, under a different agency." My grip tightened on the phone. "They can't," he agreed, "but they can test boundaries." I looked around the small apartment, plain walls, borrowed furniture, nothing sentimental enough to be weaponized. "Then it's time," I said. "Time for what?" he asked. "Time to stop reacting and start deciding." Because somewhere between the ICU and this quiet room, I understood something fundamental. My family wasn't trying to save me. They were trying to replace me. And I was done letting them. I thought reclaiming my freedom would be enough, but when I learned what they planned to do next and how far they were willing to go, I realized this wasn't just about my home anymore. It was about control. I learned about the meeting by accident. Daniel had asked me to come by his office to sign a few additional documents. Routine follow-ups, he said. Nothing urgent. I was flipping through the copies he'd prepared when I noticed a familiar address listed in the margin of an email printout. A community center on the north side of town. It was the same place Melissa used for PTA meetings, the same place Jason volunteered once a year for appearances. Seeing it there made my stomach tighten. "What's that?" I asked, tapping the paper. Daniel glanced at it, then sighed. "That's where your children filed an emergency petition." The room felt suddenly very small. "Emergency for what?" I asked. To declare you medically unfit, he said plainly. They're requesting temporary guardianship. For a moment, I couldn't speak. After everything, after the ICU, the forged authority, the attempted sale of my home, they were still pushing, still convinced that if they moved fast enough, they could override reality. They're saying I'm confused, I said slowly. Yes, and that you're being manipulated by outside parties. I almost laughed. They are the outside parties, I said. Daniel nodded, which is why we're prepared. Prepared was an understatement. Over the next 48 hours, my life was turned into documentation, medical evaluations, cognitive tests, statements from doctors who had treated me both before and after the stroke. Each professional confirmed the same thing. I was fully competent. Still, competence didn't stop desperation. The hearing was scheduled quickly, too quickly. Melissa and Jason wanted momentum. They wanted to paint a picture before I could fully respond. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully. Not formally, not defensively, just myself, calm, grounded. They were already there when I arrived. Melissa avoided my eyes. Jason nodded stiffly as if politeness might disguise intent. Their attorney, a woman with a tight smile and an efficient manner, greeted Daniel with professional warmth. Inside the small hearing room, the judge listened patiently as Melissa spoke. "She's not herself," Melissa said, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "The stroke changed her. She's paranoid. She thinks we're trying to hurt her." Jason followed, describing concern, responsibility, sacrifice. He spoke about my declining judgment and the burden of managing my affairs. I noticed how often he said, "we." When it was my turn, Daniel stood, but I raised a hand. "I'd like to speak," I said. The judge nodded. I didn't rush. "I had a stroke," I began. "I was unconscious in the ICU. During that time, my children left the state for vacation. When I returned home, I discovered my house had been listed for sale without my knowledge or consent." Melissa shifted in her seat. "I am not confused. I am informed, and I am here because I refuse to be erased under the guise of care." The judge looked directly at Melissa. "Is that accurate?" Her attorney cleared her throat. "There were misunderstandings." "Were there?" the judge asked calmly. Daniel submitted the evidence, the invalid power of attorney, the messages discussing my removal, the illegal listing attempts. The room went very quiet. The judge reviewed everything slowly. Then she looked up. "This petition is denied, and I advise the petitioners to cease further attempts to interfere with Ms. Davis's autonomy." Melissa's face drained of color. Jason stared at the table. As we left the building, neither spoke to me. Their silence felt heavier than any argument. Outside, Daniel turned to me. "They won't try this again, not legally." "And otherwise?" I asked. He gave me a measured look. "People who lose control don't always stop wanting it." That night, I returned to the apartment and sat quietly, letting the weight of the day settle. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt wary. Because the hearing had confirmed something I had been avoiding. My children weren't acting out of fear. They were acting out of entitlement. I changed my phone number the next day. I redirected my mail. I placed a legal notice preventing any future real estate actions without direct court approval. Each step felt less like retreat and more like fortification. A week later, I received a message from an unknown number. "You're tearing this family apart." I deleted it without responding. Families that survive only through control were already broken. What unsettled me most wasn't their anger, it was their certainty, the belief that my life belonged to them because they were younger, stronger, more convenient replacements. That belief hadn't appeared overnight. It had grown quietly, fed by years of small concessions. And now, stripped of cooperation, it had turned ugly. I looked around my temporary apartment, neutral walls, quiet corners, and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't hiding. This was resetting, and for the first time since the ICU, I wasn't reacting to their moves. I was planning my own. I thought the court's decision would finally stop them, but what I discovered next about what they had already set in motion proved that the real battle had never been about guardianship. It was about money. Money leaves a trail. I learned that long before I ever stepped into a courtroom. Bills, transfers, account activity. Numbers don't lie the way people do. And once Daniel started following the trail, the picture that emerged was far more calculated than I had imagined. It began with a call late one afternoon. "I think you should come in," Daniel said. His voice was careful, neutral in a way that told me something serious waited on the other end. When I arrived at his office, he slid a stack of printed statements across the desk, highlighted lines, circled dates, notes scribbled in the margins. "These are withdrawals from your accounts," he explained, "small at first, then larger, all authorized under that invalid power of attorney." My stomach tightened as I scanned the numbers. Utility payments I didn't recognize, credit card charges from places I had never been, furniture purchases, storage units, travel expenses, vacation expenses. "They were paying for trips?" I asked quietly. "Yes," Daniel said. "Flights, hotels, rental cars." The room went still. While I lay unconscious in the ICU, while machines breathed for me, my savings had been funding beach dinners and souvenir shops, the same vacation they had chosen over sitting by my hospital bed. I closed my eyes slowly. "This wasn't panic," I said. "This was budgeting." Daniel nodded. "They expected long-term control. These withdrawals look like preparation." Preparation for what? The answer came 2 days later. A certified letter arrived at my apartment, forwarded automatically from my old address. Inside was a notice from a private assisted living facility, one I had never toured, never approved. "Admission scheduled, deposit received." I read the letter twice, my hands growing colder with each word. "They were going to place me?" I said when I called Daniel. "Yes," he replied, "and once placed, it would have been very difficult to undo." Assisted living wasn't the issue. Choice was. They hadn't wanted me safe. They had wanted me contained. Daniel moved quickly. He froze the accounts, filed for financial restitution, documented every unauthorized transaction. What had once felt like emotional betrayal now carried legal weight. When Melissa called that night, I let it ring. When Jason left a voicemail the next morning, angry, pleading, accusatory, I deleted it without listening to the end. I wasn't interested in their explanations anymore. The following week, Daniel accompanied me to the bank. We sat across from a manager who apologized repeatedly as she reviewed the fraud report. "You're not the first," she said quietly. "Family misuse is common." Common. The word made my chest ache. How many people had been quietly erased by the ones they trusted most? How many had been labeled confused simply because they stood in the way? I left the bank with new accounts, new safeguards, and a renewed sense of clarity. Control often hides behind concern. That evening, I went through my phone contacts and did something I should have done years earlier. I removed names, not out of bitterness, but out of recognition. Relationships that existed only because I had made myself useful no longer deserved access to me. The silence that followed was startling. No frantic messages, no urgent demands, no crisis requiring my intervention, just quiet. And in that quiet, I began to understand something important. They hadn't loved me less when I stopped complying. They loved what I provided. A few days later, Daniel called again. "There's one more thing," he said. "They attempted to move funds into an offshore account." I laughed softly, not from humor, but disbelief. So that was the plan. Sell the house, move the money, place me quietly. "Yes," he replied, "but it failed." Failure hadn't changed their intent. It had only exposed it. I spent that night walking the small apartment, touching the walls, grounding myself in what was real. I wasn't weak. I wasn't lost. I wasn't disposable. I was inconvenient, and that distinction mattered. The next morning, I signed the final documents authorizing Daniel to pursue full financial recovery, not because I needed the money, but because consequences matter, not just for justice, for closure. I didn't want them punished out of anger. I wanted them stopped out of principle. As I handed Daniel the signed papers, I felt something unexpected: relief. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I had stopped negotiating my existence. For the first time since the ICU, I wasn't defending myself, I was asserting myself. And that shift changed everything. I believed exposing the money trail would end their efforts. I didn't yet realize how desperate people become when their escape plan collapses and what they would try next once they had nothing left to lose. I had seen it before, in hospital waiting rooms and court hallways and quiet moments when someone realizes the story they were counting on has fallen apart. But I had never expected to see it in my own children. The first sign came late one evening. I was halfway through reheating soup when my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. No name, just a string of digits. I let it ring. A minute later, it rang again. Then a message appeared. "We need to talk. This has gone too far." I stared at the screen, feeling nothing. No fear, no urgency, just clarity. This hadn't gone too far. It had gone exactly where truth leads when lies run out of space. I didn't reply. The next morning, Daniel called before I had even finished my coffee. "They've hired a new attorney," he said, "a very aggressive one." I sighed. "Let me guess, they're claiming emotional distress and undue influence," he confirmed. "They're suggesting you're being manipulated by me." I almost smiled. "They really don't know me anymore," I said. Daniel didn't laugh. "They're also trying to delay the restitution hearing." "Why?" I asked. "Because delaying buys time, and time gives them options." Options. That word followed me all day. I ran errands, attended physical therapy, and tried to focus on the present, but a low hum of unease followed me everywhere. Not fear, awareness, the kind that tells you someone is still circling, even if they haven't struck yet. That evening, as I returned to the apartment, something felt wrong immediately. The door was closed, but the lock resisted before clicking open. Inside, nothing was missing, nothing disturbed, except one thing. On the kitchen counter lay a familiar envelope, my handwriting, or something very close to it. Inside was a handwritten note. "I'm sorry, I didn't know what I was doing. Please forgive them." My chest tightened. Forgery doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks gentle, plausible, designed to confuse rather than convince. I called Daniel immediately. "Don't touch anything," he said. "I'm sending someone." Within an hour, a security specialist Daniel worked with arrived. He examined the door, the lock, the envelope. "No forced entry," he said, "but the lock was tested. Someone wanted access or wanted you to think they had it." A warning, not an apology. I slept poorly that night, not from fear, but from the weight of realization. They were no longer trying to win, they were trying to unsettle. The next day, Daniel arranged for additional safeguards, temporary surveillance, legal notices, documentation of the attempted intimidation. "This helps your case," he said, "but more importantly, it keeps you grounded in reality." Reality was something they had tried very hard to rewrite. 2 days later, Melissa showed up at my physical therapy clinic. I saw her reflection in the mirrored wall before I heard her voice. "Mom," she said softly. I turned slowly. She looked smaller than I remembered, not weaker, cornered. "We need to fix this. This isn't who we are." I held her gaze. "You chose to be who you are." Her eyes filled with tears. "You're destroying the family." I shook my head. "I didn't create this. I stopped pretending it didn't exist." She reached for my arm. I stepped back. I'm not your problem to solve, and I'm not your resource." Her face hardened instantly. "You think you're better than us now?" she snapped. "No," I replied. "I think I'm finished being useful to people who don't see me." She left without another word. That exchange confirmed what I already knew. They didn't miss me, they missed access. The restitution hearing arrived faster than expected. Evidence was presented, transfers documented, attempts at manipulation logged. Their new attorney argued emotion and confusion. The judge wasn't interested. Concern does not justify coercion, and family does not excuse fraud. The ruling was clear. Funds were ordered returned, penalties assessed, restrictions placed. As we left the courtroom, Daniel turned to me. "This should stop them." "Should," I repeated. He studied me carefully. "You don't believe that." "I believe they're out of moves," I said. "That doesn't mean they're out of motives." That night, I sat alone in the apartment reflecting on how far things had gone. I had lost my illusion of family, but gained something stronger: discernment. I no longer confused proximity with loyalty or obligation with love. And most importantly, I no longer doubted myself, because the greatest manipulation they had attempted wasn't financial or legal. It was convincing me I didn't deserve authority over my own life. That lie was gone now, and without it, they had nothing left to stand on. I thought the legal victory would finally end their interference, but one final revelation, something I never expected to learn, would force me to confront the most painful truth of all. The revelation came from a place I never expected, not from a lawyer, not from a bank statement, not even from one of my children. It came from a woman named Teresa, a neighbor I barely knew. She knocked on my apartment door late one afternoon, her posture hesitant, her eyes darting down the hallway before meeting mine. She introduced herself softly and asked if we could talk somewhere private. We sat at the small kitchen table, the same one where I had signed papers that reshaped my life. She folded her hands together, inhaled slowly, and said the words that changed everything. "I didn't know how to tell you," she began, "but I think you should know this didn't start when you got sick." My chest tightened. "What do you mean?" I asked. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I lived 2 houses down from your old place. I started noticing things about a year before your stroke. Your kids coming by without you. Real estate agents, contractors." My fingers curled against the table. "They were talking about selling the house, not casually, seriously. I overheard Melissa telling someone, 'Once Mom's health declines, it'll be easier.'" The room felt suddenly airless. "Declines," I repeated. Teresa nodded. "They assumed it was inevitable, like they were just waiting." Waiting. That word echoed long after she left. That evening, I sat alone, replaying every interaction from the past few years. The subtle pressure to downsize, the constant comments about how much work the house was, the way my independence had slowly been reframed as stubbornness. I had thought my stroke changed everything. It hadn't. It had simply given them permission. For the first time, I allowed myself to see the full picture, not just the crisis, but the lead-up, the grooming, the soft conditioning, the repeated suggestion that I was becoming a burden long before I ever was. This wasn't panic-driven behavior. It was premeditated. I called Daniel immediately. "They planned this, long before I got sick." He was quiet for a moment. "That aligns with what we've seen," he said carefully. "There were early inquiries, unofficial valuations, exploratory paperwork." "So I wasn't imagining it," I whispered. "No," he said gently. "You were being positioned." Positioned. That word hurt more than betrayal. I thought of all the times I had brushed aside discomfort to keep the peace, all the moments I had doubted myself instead of asking harder questions. I had mistaken subtle coercion for concern because it wore a familiar face. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me resolute. The next time Melissa called, I answered. Her voice sounded tired, not remorseful, frustrated. "We didn't mean for things to get this bad," she said. "You're making it harder than it needs to be." "I'm making it honest," I replied. She sighed. "You're holding on to the past." "No," I said calmly. "I'm holding on to myself." There was silence on the line. "I just want you to understand," she finally said. "We were thinking long term." "So was I replied. "That's the difference." After that, I stopped engaging altogether. No more explanations, no more defending, no more hoping for understanding that wasn't coming. I began focusing on what came next. I met with a financial planner, someone Daniel recommended, neutral and precise. We mapped out my future with clarity and control. Housing options I chose, medical plans I understood, contingencies I approved. Every decision felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been quietly set aside. I also did something unexpected. I wrote a letter, not to my children, but to myself. I wrote down everything I had ignored, every instinct I had silenced, every time I had prioritized harmony over truth. I read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it in my bedside drawer. A reminder. Time passed differently after that. The constant vigilance faded, the anxiety softened. I began sleeping through the night without rehearsing worst-case scenarios, because the most exhausting part of betrayal isn't the act itself, it's the confusion that follows. Once clarity arrived, exhaustion gave way to peace. I didn't know what the future would look like with my children. I didn't know if reconciliation was possible or even desirable. What I did know was this. I was no longer living in reaction to their expectations. I was living in alignment with my own. And that, I realized, was the one thing they could never take from me. I believed understanding their motives would finally bring closure, but one final decision, one I hadn't anticipated making, would determine how this story truly ended. The decision didn't come all at once. It arrived quietly over several weeks, in moments so small they almost went unnoticed. A morning when I woke without dread, an afternoon when I realized I hadn't checked my phone in hours, an evening when the idea of explaining myself felt unnecessary instead of urgent. That's when I knew I wasn't waiting anymore. For months, my life had been shaped by reaction, responding to threats, countering manipulation, defending my right to exist as an autonomous person. Even after the legal victories, some part of me had stayed braced, expecting another blow. But the blows stopped, not because my children changed, but because I did. I stopped giving them access to my fear. One afternoon, Daniel and I sat together reviewing the final paperwork. The restitution had been completed, safeguards were permanent, there was nothing left to contest. "You're free," he said simply. Free. The words settled into me slowly, like something I had forgotten how to hold. That evening, I took a walk alone as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. I passed couples, families, people absorbed in lives that had nothing to do with mine. For the first time in a long while, that didn't make me feel isolated. It made me feel unburdened. I thought about the version of myself who woke up in the ICU, confused and terrified, believing the greatest danger she faced was her own fragile body. She had no idea that the real threat waited outside those hospital walls, quiet, smiling, armed with paperwork and entitlement. That woman survived anyway, not because she was strong in the way people like to admire, but because she learned something far more important. She learned to trust herself again. I made my decision the following week. I wrote 2 letters, The first was to Daniel, thanking him, not just for the legal protection, but for believing me without hesitation, for treating my clarity as competence, not defiance. The second was to my children. It wasn't long. I didn't list grievances. I didn't demand apologies. I didn't explain myself. I told them I was choosing distance, not as punishment, but as preservation. That I wished them well, but I would no longer participate in a relationship that required my disappearance to function. I sealed the envelopes and mailed them without rereading. Some words don't need revision. After that, I focused on building something entirely my own. I moved again, this time by choice. A smaller place near a park with large windows and quiet mornings. I furnished it slowly, deliberately, selecting each item because it pleased me, not because it fit anyone else's expectations. I joined a local book club, took watercolor classes, volunteered at a community center, not as a caretaker, but as a participant. People asked questions sometimes about my family, about why I lived alone. I answered honestly when I felt like it, and when I didn't, I smiled and changed the subject. Privacy, I learned, is power. Months passed. There were moments of sadness, of course. Grief doesn't disappear just because clarity arrives. But the grief changed shape. It softened. It stopped demanding explanation. I no longer wondered what I could have done differently, because the truth was simple and steady. I had done enough. One morning, while sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, I caught my reflection in the window. Older, yes, changed, but peaceful in a way I hadn't been for years. That was when I understood how this story truly ended. Not with reconciliation, not with punishment, not even with justice exactly. It ended with ownership of my time, of my space, of my future. I didn't lose my family because I asserted myself. I found myself because I stopped negotiating my worth. And that, more than anything they tried to take, was what I refused to give up. If there is one thing I know now, it's this. You do not owe access to anyone who mistakes control for care. You do not owe silence to protect someone else's comfort, and you do not owe your life to people who planned for it without you. I survived the ICU, but more importantly, I survived the moment I realized I deserved more. If you're listening to this and something feels uncomfortably familiar, ask yourself one question. Where in your life are you being asked to disappear? And what would happen if you finally refused?